Okay, let's start with the social design thing. Social design as a term is, it's problematic, because as lots of designers say, I do social anyway. Yeah. You deal with users, groups, and so on, and it is by default social. So, what's the big story with this? And I think the other problem is that it's such a broad umbrella anyway, because social design takes in to some degree kind of community practices, community-based practices, activist practices, through to working in public health sectors, through to working policy, and so on. And broadly, we just try and say, well, it's non-commercial work, but even that's problematic as well, because lots of social design, there's a whole commercial sector within what we might call social design. Lots of consultancies working in public sector work, but making money. Okay, so we just say, well, it's a kind of discursive moment. Social design is a useful term to cover this broad field. And something I've been kind of concerned about and trying to grapple with some writing recently is this whole problem, though. Once you call it social design, you have to say, well, where is the social in social design? How does it approach society, and what conceptions of the social does it have, and so on. So, and I think there's a really strong tradition in design which is, in a funny way, at odds with some notion of the social, because running right from the 60s, with developments in industrial design through ergonomics and user-centered design and so on, it uses the individual as the single unit, I suppose, so there's this very strong idea of the user interaction with the object or the experience or the service, and so on. The customer journey, sometimes it's called in service design. And I think allied with that is the issue that design is such a project-based activity, as in, and this runs through professional design right through design education and so on. You take on a problem, you do your whatever it is, your discovery phase or whatever you want to call it, your research or so on, and you work through to addressing that problem. I would say solving that problem, maybe addressing that problem, and so on. And then you go on to something else. So by those two means, by those two ways, one, the focus on individual use, and two, the kind of project base of design culture, means that there's constant fragmentation going on, a bit like your colleague was saying about this notion that maybe that's good enough. Maybe that's what designers should focus on, what they're good at, do these projects and so on, and hope they have some traction in wider ways. Now, I kind of disagree with that, actually, because I think there's a huge amount of design practice, well, not design practice, even aspiration, let's call it, in design, to get involved in policy-related stuff, to get involved in public sector work and so on, without really understanding the bureaucratic systems of things like local authorities, without challenging or thinking about the workings of power, be they the kind of macro systems of, big economic processes of funding and so on, so for example, thinking about, well, what is happening in the public sector in terms of the influence of companies like Capita and Serco and so on, and using that context in some way, subverting it, working within it, adjusting it, or whatever it is. so there's that sort of the macro side, but also some micro side of bureaucracies and power and policymakers and so on, of just the everyday language which is used in policy, the everyday interactions and so on. So I think this is where, for example, my colleague Lucy Kimball's work, she's been doing up until recently a one-year research fellowship with the AHRC, working with the Policy Lab in the Cabinet Office. The Policy Lab has been in existence for, I think, about 18 months or so, still going strong, and was set up, interestingly, partly through the Design Commission report, which through APDIG, which made a recommendation that there should be some kind of policy lab using design methods within policy making. And so it led to this policy lab, which has been sort of flying by the shirt of its pants, or whatever the term is, working in very agile, flexible ways within the Cabinet Office. Now, Lucy's role was to sort of be a kind of embedded sort of autoethnography sort of fellow within this, to really think about what is going on there in this space of policy and design, at least within the Cabinet Office. Because what's happening there, particularly led by Andrea Sjöbook, is to really kind of get policymakers thinking in designerly ways. So it's back to that thing, though, of thinking about end users, thinking about user journeys and experiences and so on. Of what is the actual material impact of a policy, I suppose. And part of that is also using prototyping as a way of creating kind of evidence base. So you kind of cast ahead and produce some sort of model of what might happen as a way of then looking at, well, what does this actually mean, and so on. I think they've been revealing some really powerful ways which designers can work in policy and making those kinds of connections. But it involves, it's a two-way thing. It involves a whole cultural change within the civil service at the same time, which is kind of happening. Bits and pieces.
The policy lab exists.
Yes, exactly.
That's
but it's also
exciting.
Coming through other routes as well, through the government digital service and the behavioural insights team, and so on. This is why we're kind of living in quite interesting times for. Particularly for people who are fairly emergent, working through their PhDs and so on. And I think, and it's really interesting if you look at the many of the people working in this sector professionally, like in consultancies like Us Creates and the Innovation Unit and STBY and so on, they are kind of very closely linked to academia as well. Lots of them do teaching, lots of them have got PhDs, they speak at conferences and so on. So, and I think a lot of this whole field in a way has been already developed through PhDs and through academia and related stuff.
I wonder if it's helpful to reflect on the trajectory of your own career, and a question I've asked many people is, when they were doing PhD or early on, did they envisage doing the sorts of work they do now, and path unravelling the way it has? May not be possible to answer.
In the longer term, I didn't think I would. My first degree was in art history, and then I went on to do design history. And although my master's and then my PhD was very much about economic and political change, particularly in Hungary and Spain and so on, so I was kind of close to that, and I was talking, often interviewing people who were working in policy-related fields for that kind of research. But I didn't think I would actually be involved in some way in as a sort of active stakeholder in policy making in some way, in fairly indirect ways, nonetheless. I think the kind of break for me was in about 2003 or 4, 5, somewhere around there, where I was head of research at Leeds Metropolitan University, or head of research in art, architecture and design. I think there were kind of something to do with the cultural context there, of Leeds having had quite a long tradition in what I suppose later becomes called design activist sort of activities and so on. The landscape architecture department where I was partly based had a kind of community design unit for a very long time, running back way to the 70s, quite well known and so on. So there was this kind of and there was a kind of historic moment there of universities really beginning to open up and thinking about the relationship to the communities or the cities or the towns or wherever they were in, and so on. So I kind of drew all these activities together in some way to create a unit called Design Leeds, which was we set out to have to undertake research and consultancy in the kind of community / regeneration / local or municipal policy end of things, and I suppose this is where I began to see the need to understand how these different bureaucracies were sort of functioning and so on. And I was lucky to work with some people who were already quite close to those bureaucracies and kind of knew how to navigate their way through them and get conversations going. But I think the other thing, though, at the time, at the beginning, I found it was a bit like banging on a door which seemed permanently locked rather than permanently open. With at the time, with local authorities and so on, and you kind of felt you were sort of jumping up and down, saying, "Look, we're here. We've got this amazing expertise in a university which we can draw on." And then, round about 2007-8, there was a real sea change, and I don't know if that was to do with some wider policy calls or something, but suddenly regional development agencies and so on were really kind of quite keen to pull in our work. And I don't know whether that was because we were a lot cheaper, or we had the kudos of being a university, or someone was leaning on them to sort of say, "Hey, you should be working with the universities." But
something happened.
Something happened, yeah, and it was kind of really interesting moment. And maybe it was also about building up a kind of profile and reputation, and so on. And building up those kinds of networks, and they do take an awful long time to develop, I think. And particularly I'm not sure if this is quite the same in the commercial sector. It's certainly different, but people in the commercial sector design, many of the people I've spoken with, talk about the cycles of work, the process of working is much slower, much longer term with public sector and so on. That may be so, but even so, there's still problems aligning the kind of pace and rhythm of academic work with public sector bodies. Beyond that as well is that in public sector bodies, you're always getting changes of regime, changes of policy, and so on. So, for example, one quite long-term project we did for the Regional Development Agency, by the time we got to the end of it, the Regional Development Agency, Yorkshire Forward, knew that they wouldn't exist anymore. You know?
Yeah.
And in fact, I think the project, in a way, has continued beyond the life of the original funders, and so on. So, but continued beyond that life into another life of policy.
I mean, I suppose the point is that these are challenges that you don't have in the private sector. I mean, you're not often going to find yourself work.
Private sector still does changes of CEOs and things like that. They have changes of policy as well.
They do, but it's presumably less marked.
Yeah, maybe there's less. I think there's less buy-in. I think buy-in to a project.
Yeah.
In a way.
Yeah.
Because partly to do with the exchange is different. It's a much more of a clear financial exchange.
Mm-hmm.
So I did a project with a commercial organisation about 3 years ago, and again, once we'd done it, there'd been a change of directorship of this company. They didn't want to use any of it. We still got paid.
Yeah.
It was a shame in a way.
Yeah.
It didn't get used, but there you go. Whereas I think with the public sector organisation, there's certainly a sense of a commitment to a project. In a sense.
Well, there's more at stake, I suppose, isn't there? They have to be They have to
Absolutely.
make the use of what they're spending money on.
Yes, there's accountability,
Yeah.
and so on. I mean, of course, commercial organisations, for example, have accountability to their shareholders, but often they're dealing with really tiny amounts of money comparatively.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I guess.
In tiny amounts in relation to the whole of and so on. With a large commercial organisation. So I think it's quite interesting because we're just coming to the end of about a 1 year project, 9 month project, which has been about experimenting new forms of collaboration through design research in the sort of social/public sector, I suppose. So some with NGOs, some with kind of grassroots organisations, and so on. And I think one of the things we're finding with this is that the projects in which the questions of the research are developed, are co-produced, with your collaborators or stakeholders or whatever it is, as I say at the start, work much more efficiently. There's a sense, as I said before, about all the members of this mixed team being dedicated to a sense of, let's call that project or politics or agency or something like that.
So this is at Brighton in your.
Well, it's through Brighton.
Capacity? Okay.
Yeah, it's through Brighton as a sort of as an umbrella to 5 projects which have taken place all around the country.
Okay.
In fact,
sounds complicated.
It is. Yes. Yeah, and in a sense we set up the kind of the network and the circumstances for project teams to be created through a sort of 2-day workshop, and then these teams then worked on these projects through the summer in a really kind of agile, quick sort of way.
Sounds like a great model.
Well, it is and it isn't.
No.
I think there's several things there. It's great because they were sort of not hugely funded. There wasn't a lot, so they could be much more risky and short and snappy and flexible and so on. I think again, one of the key messages from this was the difficulty of working in that way with multi-stakeholders in these fast ways is that it's a lot more work than it looks on paper. B, I think, is getting the alignment, trying to negotiate between institutions. So institutions like universities have all their norms, their sort of ethics procedures, their financial procedures, and so on. And if you're working with external publics, like community groups or whatever, and you're having to get, for example, ethical clearance for a project, you want to start next week.
You have to wait for the next board meeting.
And exactly, and that is something which has got to be looked at, I think.
Yes.
If this kind of nexus of academia and policy is going to be more I think it's about a different kind of approach and temporality, I suppose. Through doing this kind of design-based research than you'd normally get through, say, a public policy research institute. Who maybe work on quite long-term, large-scale projects. I'm involved in another project which is a 3-year thing. With a consortium of universities, and it's in some ways it's quite hairy and fast, and so on. We've had to move very fast at the beginning of the project to get it going, and so on. But on the other hand, largely speaking, it's hasn't been too difficult in terms of this project. Functioning within the bureaucratic systems of several universities and so on, because of the long time scale.
Although 3 years goes pretty quickly, I'm sure.
Sure. Whereas I think there's several things with, say, design-based research within say a PhD, for example. If you're going to sort of get involved within a PhD of some policy-related area through design methods and so on, that's not going to take your whole, let's for the sake of argument, you're doing a full-time 3-year PhD. That's not going to take you your whole 3 years. And it might be quite flexible. You don't know how it's going to be set up. You don't know what the outcomes are. You perhaps don't even know who the stakeholders are. Part of the project might be about discovering those stakeholders or producing stakeholders, if you like. So another issue, I think, is in this, and it's back to this question of the social and social design. Is that in a way you could think of two models of interacting with people outside, let's say, call it outside academia. One is to identify your organisation or institution, whatever it is, be a charity or be a community group or a user group and that sort of thing, and to some degree its own procedures and so on are pre-formed, and its own sociality, if you like, is pre-formed, and so on. And that you could say that is a quicker route to a quick win with things. You might think of it entirely as, well, the project might be about producing publics. About
bringing people together,
communities of practice or whatever it is, bringing people together, who that's making links and so on. So, for example, last night I was talking with someone who's working in this kind of public sector policy-related work, who's and this is kind of in quite big policy areas, is working between the Department of Work and Pensions and the Department of Health, and so creating kind of new alliances and ways of thinking between those two departments, which is really interesting and challenging.
Yes, absolutely, that is interesting.
Again, because you've probably got different languages spoken within each one and so on.
I always come at it from an anthropological perspective, thinking that must take so long to understand, but
yeah.
but I'm sure that's not a luxury people have in that sort of capacity.
Yeah. And I think the thing is with that is, I mean, I was talking earlier about some of the problems of this kind of like user-based design stuff. But on the other hand, you could say that one of the big advantages of that is that when you think about people's everyday lives, it probably cuts through all those sorts of bureaucratic structures of the public sector in a way. It's like it's like when people come to this museum, the V&A, they're not interested in that there's a furniture, textiles and fashion department, or there's a Asian department or whatever. They just want to come and see really interesting stuff, So they're not interested in the bureaucracies behind this place, No. So
it's worth remembering, isn't it?
Yeah.
And so your V&A connection, how did that come about?
There was someone who was a research fellow funded by the University of Brighton for about 13 years here, and she focused very much on contemporary products and the questions of how you deal with contemporary products under contemporary design in a curatorial sense. How do you create exhibitions out of that? And she did some really good work. She went off to another post. I was appointed to this post, and I sort of brought in a kind of different kind of agenda, which was to say, okay, the museum is very good at thinking about objects and very good about thinking about sort of individual beautiful objects in cases and so on. What if we think about design being actually not, it is sometimes about individual objects, but a lot of the time it's about ecologies or suites of objects and so on. So for example, and to ask a really basic question, the cycle renting systems, like the Boris bike or something like that. It's not just a bike. It's a whole digital system. It's a series. It's a support system for maintenance. It's requires credit card systems and posts and all these sorts of things. So it can't function unless
it's more of an actor network theory.
Yes, exactly. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So how do we deal with this in the museum? And it's, and also, how do you deal with contemporary issues currently? So if the object of design of some design is now behaviour change, whether you agree with that as an object or not as a decent object to be designing, I think it's really important to have those sorts of debates and have these things represented. And so initially what I've been doing over the last 4 years or so has been to, rather than think about these in curatorial terms, think of these in just as the museum as a place of debate and so on. So for example, on the behaviour change thing, next week I'm running a sort of panel discussion around the ethics, if you like, of design and behaviour change.
That's fascinating.
It's kind of, as you know, I got involved in the APDIG Design Commission thing on public services and so on. Partly because I have had some experience of working in the public sector or related to the public sector practices, and from a museum point of view, it does beg the question: well, what is a museum for? Beyond collecting objects and so on. Can it step further into being a place of advocacy? And if so, what things should it be or could it be advocating?
And how?
Yes, and how,
Yeah.
and so on.
That's very interesting.
I think there's a sense of the director's keen that the museum is engaged with current issues,
Mm-hmm.
social, political, economic, environmental, and so on. And that is just one way to sort of be seen to be doing that, and building the networks, I suppose.
I've had interesting conversations with others, and this overlaps now nicely with our museums case study, but we've been talking about the way museums have sort of had to reinvent themselves because of funding constraints and whatever else, and political demands. But that is an opportunity, and how different museums and bodies representing university museums in particular have
That's interesting.
responded, and it's not dissimilar. I have to say, it's just not something that, as a lay person, really effectively, I've really thought about. So
Yes, yeah. I mean, if you think about, I don't know. Currently, for example, there's this Ai Weiwei exhibition at the Royal Academy, which coincides with the visit of President Mr. China, President Xi, and that is measly puts the RA, not into a neutral position, really, and it presumably stirs up debates and articles and so on.
Yes, that's a curious one. Anyway,
PhDs, doing PhDs. Yeah.
I mean, I probably should have brought we have quite a range. The design students who are attending the workshop have some brilliant projects, and they're really varied. Some are sort of to do with prosthetic limb design and something or other, and another, then there's something to do with social housing and happiness, everything you can imagine. I can't remember, but to me they all seemed very much to be filled with policy potential. Yeah. And I'd imagine that PhD students in design, I just kind of assumed, I suppose, that they'd know what to do with their research. Yeah. Is that true?
No, I think it's partly to do with, to some degree, the nature of doing a PhD. You just get so
even
utterly,
in design.
Yeah, you just get so utterly obsessed with this thing you're doing.
Yeah.
And
one thing they can obviously do is, keep in the loop with the likes of Policy Connect, and when they're promoting an evidence call in a specific area, I imagine most people can have something to say on behavioural change and design, to get involved in that way, and that's a relatively straightforward process, but perhaps daunting if you've never done it before. I imagine it's not a requirement of PhD funding, is it, to have a sort of pathway to impact at that level? So it's probably not something that people have thought about from the start, which is what everyone's always advised to do. So I think it's probably people, like you say, involved, focused on their PhD and then thinking, hang on, I've got stuff emerging here, I want to do something with it. And also in terms of, thinking about then trying to get a job afterwards too, in academia or not. But different sector entirely, but for me, I literally, especially when you're in that time between your Viva and having a job, which can seem like sort of, if you have one, some people don't, but I just literally cold call different organisations who I thought would be relevant.
Yeah, sure.
And some of them were responsive, and then I got commissioned work related, which was one way of doing it, and was, but I didn't really have a strategy. It was all very messy.
I did that with my masters way back. Absolutely. But I think it's the simple answer would be to say, go back to the thing I was saying earlier about, and I've made this point at a Design Star event as well, this thing about seeing your PhD as a broad set of practices. So you've got your PhD project, and you've got this sort of grey area around it where you're meeting people, interviewing people, whatever, and so on. But then beyond that as well, there are lots of opportunities to be sometimes in quite informal ways, testing out, learning new things, just being involved in other fora as well.
Being open to that, isn't it?
Yeah. And that might happen in all kinds of ways. That might happen in, some PhD students. One of mine is edited a book on museums during whilst doing her PhD. In fact, two of our CDAs have. Let's see. And then there's another one who's also working in kind of commercial / public sector consultancy work and so on, and but also using some of that as an evidence base for her PhD.
Yeah.
So
is that problematic ever? Are there issues with intellectual property and things?
Depends. Yeah, depends. I mean, it's obviously something you've got to test out and keep an eye on, and so on. But to I mean, I think one of the problems is that at the moment, as well, is that the kind of route to policy, particularly at sort of national government level, it's seen as if you've got to have this, you've got to be a professor of 20 years standing,
you have to earn your stripes.
7 billion peer-reviewed articles behind you, and so on, and have that kind of confidence.
Yeah.
And I remember reading of one of such professors, say, every time I go into the cabinet office, it seems like the average age there is 23. And he sort of felt this terrible sort of disconnect, between him and his people at the same time, and it'd be interesting to speculate on whether other routes are opening up, given this sort of, I don't know if it's nominal or actual, sort of move to more open government and so on, localism agenda and so on. But maybe there's another way of approaching it. I'm not sure at this stage whether movements in localism or open government and this will open up new spaces for PhD students to be kind of actively involved. It'd be nice to think there was. Unless, of course, there's a project which comes along and they know there's a PhD student with a certain amount of expertise and so on. Maybe,
it's worth having being on the radar.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So
no harm, is there?
So I know someone, for example, who's doing PhD on intellectual property and fashion at the moment, and she is also, she's set up a kind of blog about this, which is a sort of multi-author blog, and so she's appointed herself as editor-in-chief of this thing, and so on, which I think is really interesting way then of building up networks and so on, exchanging information.
That's
and
a
so
really good point.
I know because she basically sort of approached me, say, oh, I see you doing these salons, would you like to do something on intellectual property and so on? And we said yes. So we did one last month.
It's just about being a bit
proactive,
exactly.
Seeing
where the opportunities are.
And for me, if she was a student I was supervising, I'd say, that's a really good part of your PhD to be doing this sort of thing, these activities.
Definitely.
And I think maybe it's also when you're dealing with, very contemporary stuff which is emergent and so on. Again, it's a bit like prototyping. You are creating the evidence base, as you go along. It's not like going to a dusty archive. It's actually you have to almost create the discourse.
Yeah.
And the discussion.
Extra layer of work, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
It's very exciting.
It is. On a sort of more a material level, for example, one of my PhD students has been doing his PhDs on community gardens. And so he spent some of the time in Berlin, some of it in Paris, some of it working in Brighton, and so on, just basically working on these community gardens. Now the issue he's found is to do with the object of research, really, and the perennial issue of the kind of embeddedness of the socially embedded researcher, as in he's lending a hand, he's producing stuff within these things, but he's also taking a critical eye on how these things are sort of functioning. And it's quite difficult, and I found this in other projects as well. Sometimes it's quite difficult when you're working with external organisations for them to kind of come along as the sort of critical friend, really, because they hear the critical bit and sometimes not the friend bit.
Yeah, of course.
Yes. And I've had one or two kind of sticky situations where another researcher in a project, in a sort of policy-related thing, has come in as this kind of pure anthropologist, for example. No, not pure anthropologist. I shouldn't say that, because if she had been, she wouldn't have said what she said. Actually, but taking a very kind of critical, but well-informed, critical point of view on the motivations and approaches and so on of this kind of organisation and so on. And sometimes it's kind of quite difficult, because to steer that line between sort of analysis, critical analysis and so on, and being seen to be undermining, I suppose.
Definitely. I see that. I run a placement module with undergraduates, and they have some sort of similar dynamic issues. Both working for an organisation and just being a lowly intern, and also writing a critical essay with recognition.
I think it goes back to, I imagine you can't do this at undergraduate level, but it's back to that thing about you're a much safer territory and much more productive territory sometimes if the research is co-produced with the people. So in other words, you're in an organisation. The organisation isn't just the object of research.
Working with you. Yes.